James Averill stood at the window of his study, gazing down at the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles below. The city lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, but to him they felt cold and distant. His mansion, perched high in the Hollywood Hills, was the embodiment of success. Marble floors, soaring ceilings, walls adorned with old masters' paintings, and furniture that only a select few could afford. At 48, he had achieved what many only dreamed of: billions in the bank, a name known in business circles, and a reputation as a man always one step ahead. Yet behind this facade lay an emptiness, deep and resonant, like an echo in an abandoned house. James was alone. His parents had passed away years ago. He had no siblings, and his friends, if they could be called that, had faded into the past, leaving only vague memories of raucous parties and hollow conversations. He had grown accustomed to solitude. It had become a part of his life, like his morning coffee or the sound of his footsteps on marble. But in recent months, the silence of the mansion had begun to weigh on him more heavily than ever. It started with small things: slight fatigue he attributed to age, headaches he blamed on overwork. A man of action, not prone to complaints, he ignored his body's signals for a long time. Then came the pain. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a whisper in the dark, but with each passing day, it grew louder, more insistent, until it became a scream he could no longer silence. James summoned a doctor, not to a hospital, but to his study, where he felt safe, surrounded by books and leather armchairs. Dr. Williams, an elderly man with weary eyes, arrived with a briefcase in hand and got straight to work without preamble. The examination, tests, and questions passed quickly, too quickly. When the results came back, Williams sat across from James, placed a folder on the desk, and spoke. His voice was steady, professionally detached, but it carried a weight. "Pancreatic cancer," he said, looking somewhere to the side. "Late stage. Surgery isn't an option anymore. Chemotherapy might buy you some time, but I'd say a year. Maybe a little more, maybe less." James nodded as if he'd been given a weather forecast. He thanked the doctor, escorted him to the door, and returned to the study. Only then, after closing the heavy oak door behind him, did he allow himself to sit and close his eyes. A year. The word rang like a sentence, but it wasn't death that frightened him. He wasn't a religious man, didn't believe in an afterlife or a higher judgment. His fear was different, more earthly, more human. He feared disappearing, not just dying, but vanishing as if he'd never existed. His money would scatter to charities he'd never cared about. His name would fade in a few years, like those of countless other tycoons, and his mansion would become an empty shell for strangers to inhabit. That thought was unbearable. He rose and approached the fireplace, where a single photograph of his parents stood on the mantel, the only one in the house. His father, tall and stern, stared at the camera with pride. His mother, gentle and smiling, held his hand. They had died when James was 25, leaving him a modest inheritance he'd turned into an empire. But they'd had a family, a story, roots. And he? Nothing. No wife, no children, not even distant relatives who might remember him fondly. He'd built his life around work, around success, and now, standing on the edge, he realized it wasn't enough. James poured himself a whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. The liquid burned his throat, but brought no relief. He stared at the glass, twirling it in his hands, and thought about what he could have done differently. There had been women, beautiful, intelligent, willing to share his life. But he'd always pushed them away, unwilling to bind himself with obligations, There had been moments when he could have paused, looked around, built something real. But he'd pressed forward, never looking back, and now time had run out. And then an idea took root in his mind. At first it seemed absurd, almost laughable, but the longer he dwelled on it, the more it gripped him, like a final ray of light in a darkened room. A child. Not now, not in the traditional sense. His body could no longer grant him that possibility. But he could leave behind an heir, a son or daughter to carry on his lineage, his name. It was mad, selfish, but it held meaning, the only meaning he could find. He didn't want to die empty. Emily Grace had entered his life 12 years ago. She was 20 when she first crossed the threshold of his mansion, a slight girl with long blonde hair and eyes the color of a cloudy sky. She'd come from a small town in Oregon, where her family had struggled to make ends meet. There were no jobs there, no prospects, so Emily, with her meager savings in hand, had set out for Los Angeles, hoping for a better life. She'd found a job listing for a housekeeper at James Averill's home through an agency, passed the interview, and was hired. Back then, he'd barely noticed her, just another employee tasked with keeping his house in order. But over the years, Emily had become something more. She cooked his breakfasts, always something simple yet delicious, like an herb omelette or avocado toast. She ensured the house was spotless, the flowers in vases fresh, his suits pressed. Sometimes she'd sit in a corner of the living room with a book while he worked, her presence unobtrusive yet calming. James rarely spoke to her about anything beyond household matters. He knew she had no husband, no children, and seldom left the mansion even on her days off. But her past, her dreams, what lay behind her quiet smile, he never asked. It was enough that she was there. Emily was loyal to him, not out of fear or calculation, but from some inner sense of duty he couldn't fully grasp. She never complained, never asked for a raise, never hinted at wanting more. Sometimes he caught her gaze, attentive, slightly sad, but he'd look away, unwilling to delve into what it might mean. She was a part of his life, yet she remained at a distance, like a shadow always near but never touching. That evening, after the doctor's visit, James decided he would talk to her. He didn't know how to broach the subject, how to explain something he barely understood himself, but Emily was the only person he could trust, not because they were close, but because she was honest. He called her to the study, pressing the intercom button on his desk. A few minutes later, she entered, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was gathered in a loose bun, and a faint flush lingered on her cheeks, likely from being in the kitchen. "Sit down, Emily," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His voice was hoarse, and he cleared his throat to mask it. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. Her movements carried their usual grace, but a flicker of surprise passed through her eyes. James rarely summoned her so late, let alone asked her to sit. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy like fog over the city. "Emily," he began, and his voice faltered, catching him off guard. "I need to talk to you about something important. Very important." She nodded, her gaze steady. There was no curiosity in her eyes, only a readiness to listen, the same readiness she'd shown in carrying out his requests all these years. "I'm dying," he said plainly, without preamble. Emily flinched, but she didn't interrupt. Her fingers tightened in her lap, though her face remained composed. "I have cancer, pancreatic, late stage. The doctors say I don't have long, maybe a year, maybe less." Her lips trembled, and a shadow of pain crossed her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer sympathy, perhaps to ask how she could help, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I don't want pity," he said, firmer than he'd intended. "I want you to hear me out. I have a request. It'll sound strange, maybe even wrong, but I'm asking you to think about it before you answer." Emily said nothing, but her posture stiffened. She sat up straight, as if bracing for a blow she couldn't foresee. James took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew his words would sound insane, knew they could shatter the fragile balance between them, but there was no turning back. "I want a child," he said, meeting her eyes. "Not now, not in the usual way. My health, it won't let me have a family like others do, but I want a son or daughter to remain after I'm gone, someone to carry a part of me forward, to give my existence meaning. I can't do it myself, Emily. But you could carry it. I'm not asking for love or anything personal. It would be an arrangement. I'll provide everything: money, the house, a future for you and the child. You'll never want for anything. I just want to leave something behind. Something real." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp like shards of glass. Emily froze. Her face paled, her eyes widened, and her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles whitened. She stared at him, as if trying to discern whether he was joking, but there was no trace of jest in his gaze. Only a plea, not commanding, not demanding, but almost childlike, vulnerable. James waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew his request sounded selfish, knew it might offend her, unravel everything between them. But it was his last hope, his last chance. Emily stood without a word. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical. She looked at him once more, a long, heavy gaze that mingled shock, pity, and something he couldn't name, then left the room. The door closed behind her softly, but to James, the sound was louder than thunder. He was alone again, staring at the empty chair, and for the first time in years, he felt that his wealth, his power, his success meant nothing. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed in her small room on the second floor of the mansion, staring into the darkness. The window was ajar, and a gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden. But she didn't notice. James's words echoed in her mind, and each time she tried to make sense of them, a storm rose within her. She was afraid, not for herself, but for the possibility that she might agree to something that would change her life forever. She was ashamed, for even briefly considering his offer, and yet she couldn't shake the pity that gripped her heart like a vice. She'd known James for over a decade. He was cold, distant, sometimes sharp, but never cruel. When she'd come to him, lost and desperate, he'd given her a job, a roof over her head, a stability she'd never known. In all those years, he'd never crossed a line, never done anything to make her feel uneasy. He was her employer, her protector in a way, but not a friend. And now he was asking her for something beyond anything she could have imagined. Her thoughts tangled. On one hand, it was wrong, to use her body for his dream, to become a tool for someone else's legacy. She wasn't naive. She understood he was offering not love, not a family in the usual sense, but a transaction. Money, a house, a future. It sounded like payment for a service, not a gift. But on the other hand, she'd seen his eyes, those of a man who feared not death, but oblivion. Emily knew loneliness. She'd lived with it her whole life, hiding it behind work, smiles, quiet evenings with a book. Her parents had died when she was a teenager. She had no siblings, and dreams of her own family had long since dissolved into routine. And now she faced a choice: reject him and preserve her pride, or agree and give him what he so desperately wanted. She stood and walked to the window, gazing at the dark garden. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting a silvery glow on the trees. Emily thought of her mother, a woman with tired hands and a kind smile, who'd always told her that life wasn't just about yourself, but about others. "If you can help, help," she'd often said. But this wasn't just helping. It was giving a part of herself, her soul, her future. She thought of the child, a small being who would grow up without a father, but with his name, his blood. Could she love it? Could she live with the knowledge that it came into the world through such a strange, almost cold arrangement? The next day, she didn't come down for breakfast. James sat at the table alone, staring at an empty plate. A cup of coffee sat before him, but he didn't touch it. He wasn't angry with Emily. He understood he'd given her too much to process in one night. But the silence in the house grew heavier, and he began to think he might have crossed a line he shouldn't have. He imagined her packing her things, leaving him alone in this vast, empty mansion. That thought was worse than the diagnosis. Emily appeared only in the evening. She entered his study without knocking, which was unlike her, and stopped by the desk. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a storm, a mix of resolve, fear, and something he couldn't place. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, no apron, making her look different from the Emily he knew. She wasn't the housekeeper now, but a woman who'd come to say something significant. "I've thought about it," she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady. "I thought all night and all day, and I still don't know if it's right. I don't know if I can live with this decision, but I agree. Not for the money, James, for you. Because you don't deserve to leave like this, with nothing. You've given me more than I could have dreamed, and if I can give you this, I will." He stared at her, unable to believe his ears. A lump rose in his throat, and for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't alone. His hand trembled as he reached for her, but he stopped halfway. Instead, he nodded, and gratitude, deep, sincere, almost painful, flashed in his eyes. "Thank you, Emily," he said hoarsely. "I don't know how to repay you for this." She gave a faint smile, but it held more sadness than joy. "Just don't leave me alone with this," she replied softly. "While you're here, help me understand what I'm doing." And in that moment, a connection formed between them, thin, fragile, but real. It wasn't an end, but the beginning of something greater than either of them could foresee. The decision was made, but the silence that followed brought no relief. James sat in his study, staring at the empty whiskey glass he hadn't refilled. The light from the desk lamp fell on his hands, highlighting fine wrinkles and spots he hadn't noticed before. He felt older than his 48 years, not from the illness, but because, for the first time, he was in a situation where his money and power meant nothing. Emily had agreed, and it was more than he dared hope for. But now, an abyss of uncertainty stretched before him. How to move forward? How to turn his desperate idea into reality without breaking the fragile trust just beginning to form between them? Emily had gone to her room after their talk, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He didn't try to stop her. He knew she needed time to digest her own words. Her agreement wasn't just a response to his request. It was an act of faith, a sacrifice whose full meaning he hadn't yet grasped. James stood and walked to the window. Night had fallen over Los Angeles, and the city lights now seemed not just distant, but infinitely foreign. He thought of the child, how it might look, whether it would have his eyes, or perhaps the smile of a mother he'd never know. The thought warmed and frightened him in equal measure. He wanted this more than anything, but for the first time, he wondered if he had the right to ask it of someone else. The next morning, Emily appeared in the dining room as usual, carrying a tray. She set a plate of omelet and a cup of black coffee before him, but avoided his gaze. Her movements were as precise and calm as ever, yet there was a new tension in them, subtle but palpable, like the faint crack of glass before it shatters. James watched her, searching for words to ease the silence, but nothing came. He felt guilty, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps for dragging her into this, or for not knowing how to take the next step. "Emily," he said at last, as she turned to leave. She paused, but didn't turn back. "We need to talk about what's next. I don't want you to feel out of place. We'll do this right. I'll call doctors, lawyers, anyone who can help. You won't be alone in this." She turned slowly to face him. Her eyes were tired, but there was no anger in them, only a deep, quiet sadness. "I know you want to do this right," she said softly, "but I'm not sure there's a right here. I said yes because I believe you're a good person, James. But I don't know how I feel. I need time to figure it out." He nodded, accepting her words. For the first time in a long while, he didn't try to control the situation. He was used to being the one who made decisions, who led, but now he was a passenger, not the driver, and that scared him more than the diagnosis. Emily returned to her room after breakfast and closed the door. She leaned against the wall, feeling her heart beat faster than usual. Agreeing had been hard, and now that the words were out, she couldn't shake the sense that she'd done something irrevocable. She didn't regret it, not yet, but doubts gnawed at her like pebbles stuck in a shoe. What was she doing? Why was she doing it? For him? For herself? Or for a child that didn't yet exist? She walked to the mirror above the dresser and studied her reflection. She was 32, but in recent years, she'd rarely thought about her age. Working at the mansion had become her life, her refuge. She didn't date, didn't dream of a family. Those desires had long faded into routine. But now, a door had opened, one she hadn't expected to see. A child. Her child. And yet not entirely hers. She knew James meant a medical procedure. Artificial insemination. Nothing personal. Nothing to breach the boundaries between them. But even so, it was too close, too intimate. She would carry his blood, his DNA, his dream. Could she separate herself from that? Emily thought of her mother. She'd been just 40 when cancer took her. A different cancer from James's, but just as merciless. Her father had died earlier, in a car crash, when Emily was still a child. She'd grown up with her grandmother in a small house, with a leaking roof and creaking floors. Her grandmother passed when Emily turned 18, and since then, she'd been alone. She'd come to Los Angeles with a suitcase and $100, hoping to find a job that would let her survive. James had been that chance. He wasn't warm or open, but he was fair. He paid her more than she'd expected, gave her a room in the mansion, asked no questions about her past. And now he was asking her for something beyond anything she'd known. She sat on the bed and picked up an old photograph she kept on the nightstand. It showed her mother, young, laughing, with long blonde hair like Emily's. She remembered her mother once saying, "If life gives you a chance to change something, take it, even if it's scary." Emily wasn't sure if this was the chance her mother meant, but something in James's words had touched her. His loneliness mirrored her own. She saw how he lived, surrounded by luxury, yet empty inside. And if she could give him meaning, give him a child, wouldn't that be an act of kindness? But darker, heavier thoughts lingered. What if she couldn't love this child? What if she saw only James in it, a man who would leave her alone? What if she lost herself in the process? Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She needed to talk to him, to understand how he saw this future. She couldn't go in blind. A few days later, James arranged a meeting. He called his lawyer, Marcus Clayton, and asked him to find the best reproductive medicine specialist in the city. Marcus, a short man with a sharp gaze and a habit of speaking quickly, arrived at the mansion the next day with Dr. Linda Harris. Linda, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a calm confidence, brought a folder of documents and a laptop, showing James and Emily slides about the procedure. They sat in the living room, James in his favorite armchair by the fireplace, Emily on the sofa a little farther away, her back straight and hands folded. Marcus stood by the window, taking notes on a tablet, while Linda sat up at the coffee table, spreading out papers. She began with explanations. The process would involve collecting genetic material from James, artificial insemination, and monitoring the pregnancy. It all sounded cold, scientific, like instructions for a device. Emily listened, trying not to think that it was her body that would become part of this procedure. "We can start any time," Linda said, looking at James. "Your health still allows us to collect the material. The sooner, the better, given your condition." James nodded, but his gaze shifted to Emily. She sat silently, staring at the floor. He sensed her tension, her doubts, and it prompted him to speak. "Emily," he said quietly, "if you've changed your mind, say so now. I don't want you doing this out of duty. It has to be your choice." She looked up, and gratitude flickered in her eyes, but then she shook her head. "I haven't changed my mind," she said. "It's just complicated. I want to know what comes after. Not the money, not the house, the child. How do you see it? Who will they be to you? To me?" The question caught him off guard. He'd thought of the child as an extension of himself, a legacy, but not as someone to Emily. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck. Linda and Marcus stayed silent, recognizing this wasn't their conversation. "They'll be yours," James said at last. "Not just mine. I won't be a father in the full sense, I know that. But I want you to be their mother. Not just carry them, but raise them, love them. I'll give you everything to make that possible. And I'll try to be there as long as I can." Emily watched him for a long moment, as if weighing each word. Then she nodded, hesitantly, but firmly. "Okay," she said. "Then let's begin." The process moved faster than Emily had expected. Within a week, she underwent a checkup at the clinic, where Linda and her team assessed her health, took tests, and prepared everything needed. James provided his material too, though it wasn't easy for him, not physically, but emotionally, knowing this was his final contribution to the future. He felt vulnerable, almost humiliated, but kept it inside, showing no one. The first attempt came a month later. Emily lay in a sterile room, staring at the ceiling as the doctors worked. She felt no pain, only a strange sense of detachment, as if it wasn't happening to her. James waited in the hallway, pacing back and forth, until Linda emerged and said everything had gone well. Now they had to wait 2 weeks to see if the embryo took. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Emily's life. She kept working at the mansion, but each day was steeped in anticipation. She listened to her body, searching for signs, but felt nothing. James, meanwhile, grew gentler, more attentive. He didn't mention the child directly, but asked how she was feeling, offered her a day off, even ordered books he thought she might like. They were small gestures, but they touched her, chipping away at the wall between them. When the time came for the results, they went to the clinic together. Linda greeted them with a restrained but warm smile. "Congratulations," she said. "You're pregnant, Emily." Emily froze, unsure what to feel. Joy? Fear? Relief? She looked at James, and his face lit up with something she'd never seen before. Hope. He took her hand, squeezed it, and in that moment, she knew their bond had shifted. It was no longer just an arrangement. It was the start of something more. James couldn't believe it had worked. That night, he sat in his study, gazing at the city, and for the first time in months, felt his life had meaning. A child, his child, existed, growing inside Emily. He didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, but it didn't matter. It was life, his continuation, his answer to the death creeping closer. But with the joy came anxiety. He knew time was short. His health was worsening. Pains grew more frequent, exhaustion deeper. He started chemotherapy, hoping to gain a few months, but the side effects drained him. He hid it from Emily as best he could, not wanting to scare her, but she noticed. She saw how he paled, how his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, and instead of pulling away, she drew nearer. One evening, as he sat in the living room with a book he could barely read from fatigue, she brought him tea. She didn't leave as usual, but sat across from him, looking at him with quiet determination. "You don't have to pretend everything's fine," she said. "I see you're unwell, and I want to help, not as a housekeeper, as someone who's here." James looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but strength. He nodded, wordless, and for the first time let her see his weakness. It was a small step, but it changed everything. From that day, they began to talk, not just about the child, but about themselves. Emily told him about her mother, how she'd taught her to sew, sung her lullabies. James shared memories of his father, stern but fair, and how he'd once dreamed of building something to outlast him. These conversations were simple, but they built a bridge between them, not of romance, but of understanding. Emily felt something shift within her. The pregnancy wasn't yet visible, but she already sensed a bond with the child. She began to think of it not as part of a deal, but as her future. And looking at James, she saw not just a dying man, but the one who'd given her this chance. Her gratitude grew, mingling with a warmth she didn't dare name. James was changing too. He looked at Emily and saw not just a woman who'd agreed to help, but a person who'd become his anchor. He didn't think of love. The word felt too big, too unfit for their situation. But he felt a deep, genuine attachment to her. And when he went to bed, knowing she was in the next room, he didn't feel alone for the first time in years. Emily stood at her bedroom window, her hand resting on her stomach. 4 months had passed since she'd learned of the pregnancy, and now her body was beginning to change. A gentle curve had appeared where there'd once been flatness, and each morning she looked at herself in the mirror with a mix of wonder and awe. She hadn't known what to expect from this feeling, being a home to new life, but it was stronger than she'd imagined. Sometimes she whispered to the child, words she didn't fully understand herself. "You're mine. You'll be okay." It was a promise she made not just to them, but to herself. James noticed the changes in her before she did. He saw how her steps slowed slightly, how she'd pause, listening to something within. He didn't mention it directly, afraid of seeming intrusive, but his gaze softened, warmed. He began to notice little things, the way she wrinkled her nose at new tastes, how her fingers fidgeted with her sleeve when nervous. These details, once overlooked, now felt significant, almost precious. He didn't call it love, the word was too loud for what was growing between them, but he knew Emily had become more to him than just part of a plan. The illness didn't relent. Chemotherapy gave him time, but stole his strength. Mornings brought headaches that lingered despite pills, and by evening, his hands trembled so much he could barely hold a cup. He hid it from Emily as much as possible, but she saw. She saw how he paled, how his breath grew labored after a short walk in the garden, and instead of retreating, she came closer. She brought him mint tea she knew soothed his stomach, left books by his chair even when he didn't ask. These were small acts, but they spoke louder than words. One day, early in the 5th month, Emily insisted he join her for an ultrasound. She didn't want to go alone, not out of fear, but because she felt it should be their moment together. James hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready to see the child, a tiny being that was his last hope, but her quiet, insistent gaze convinced him. They drove to the clinic in silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and faint city sounds outside. In the doctor's office, Emily lay on the table, and James sat beside her, holding her hand. The screen flickered to life, and Dr. Linda Harris, with her usual calm assurance, guided the wand over Emily's stomach. At first, there were only vague shadows, but then the image sharpened. Emily held her breath, and James leaned closer, eyes fixed on the screen. There, amid the gray lines, they saw it, or them. A small body, tiny arms, a beating heart. Linda smiled. "Everything's fine," she said, "and it looks like you've got a surprise. It's twins." Emily turned to James, her eyes wide with astonishment. Twins, 2 children. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. James squeezed her hand tighter, and for the first time in months, a smile broke across his face, genuine, unshadowed by pain or fatigue. 2, he whispered, tasting the word. 2. He looked at Emily, and in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just his child, his legacy. It was their story, their shared dream, bigger than he'd ever imagined. As they left the clinic, he paused by the car and turned to her. "Thank you," he said softly, "for all of this, for them." Emily nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. She didn't reply, but her hand found his, and they stood there for a few seconds, looking at each other as the sun dipped behind the hills. Back home, everything changed. The news of twins brought new energy, but also new fears. Emily began to think of the future, not just the pregnancy, but what would come after. She knew James wouldn't live to see their children go to school, speak their first words. The thought came to her at night, lying in the dark, listening to the mansion's silence. She pictured 2 babies, a boy and a girl, perhaps with his dark eyes and her blonde hair, and wondered if she'd have the strength to raise them alone. But then she'd recall his voice, his promise to be there as long as he could, and it gave her hope. James thought of the future too, but differently. He wanted to leave the children more than money. He began writing letters, clumsy, full of corrections, but heartfelt. He wrote about his life, his childhood, his mistakes and triumphs. He wanted them to know him, even if he couldn't be there. Sometimes he read the letters to Emily, asking her opinion. She listened, sitting across from him, and occasionally softened his harshness with her suggestions. These evenings became their ritual, quiet but intimate. His health declined faster than he'd expected. By the 6th month, he couldn't climb stairs without help. Emily insisted he move to a room on the 1st floor, near the living room and kitchen. He resisted, unwilling to admit weakness, but she was adamant. She moved his things, set up the bed, even hung curtains she knew he liked. Dark green, like the forests he'd loved as a child. James watched her work, and something tightened in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude, it was more. One rainy night, as rain tapped against the windows, he called her to him. She entered, carrying a tray with tea, and sat by his bedside. He looked worse than he had that morning, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, but his voice was steady. "Emily," he said, "I want you to know something. When I asked you for this, I was only thinking of myself, of what I wanted to leave behind. But now I see it's not just my story. It's ours. And I'm glad it's with you." She froze, staring at him. His words were simple, but they carried such weight that tears welled in her eyes. She'd never cried in front of him, didn't want him to see her weakness, but now she couldn't hold back. "I'm glad too," she said quietly. "I didn't think it would be like this, but I'm happy it's you." He reached out, and she took his hand. His fingers were cold but firm. They sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, and in that moment, something real was born between them. Not passion, not romance, but a deep, quiet love grown from trust and pain. Emily's pregnancy progressed, and by the 7th month, she could no longer hide her exhaustion. The twins made their presence felt. Her back ached, her legs swelled, and every movement took effort. James insisted she stop working around the house. He hired a helper, a young woman named Sarah, to take over cleaning and cooking. Emily resisted, used to being useful, but he wouldn't budge. "You're doing enough," he said one day when she protested. "You're carrying my children. That's more than I could have dreamed." She relented, but couldn't sit idle. She began preparing the nursery, not one, but two, in case the twins were different genders. She chose colors, soft yellow and pale green, ordered cribs, sewed curtains by hand. James would sometimes come watch, leaning on a cane, his eyes alight with pride. He didn't say much, but his presence was the support she craved. His condition worsened daily. By the 8th month, he was bedridden. Doctors visited more often, adjusting medications, but everyone knew it was the end. Emily spent more time with him, reading books, sharing what she felt. She talked about the children, how they kicked, how she imagined their laughter. James listened, eyes closed, smiling. He didn't complain, didn't mention the pain, but she saw how he fought. One day, he asked her to bring an old box from his study. She found it on a shelf, wooden, carved with leaves, and brought it to him. With trembling hands, he opened it and pulled out 2 small medallions. They were simple, but beautiful, silver, engraved with a tree. "These were my mother's," he said. "I want them to have them. One for each." Emily took the medallions, feeling their weight. She nodded, unable to speak. That evening, she sat with him until he fell asleep, and for the first time, let herself imagine their children wearing those medallions. It was a bittersweet vision, joy laced with inevitable loss. Labor came earlier than expected. At 36 weeks, in the middle of the night, Emily woke to sharp pain. She knew it was contractions, and, despite the fear, acted swiftly. She called Linda, woke Sarah, and within an hour, an ambulance was rushing her to the hospital. James wanted to go with her, but he was too weak. He stayed at the mansion, lying in bed, Clutching the phone, Sarah left him to await news. The birth was long and grueling. Emily held on, picturing James's face, his voice, his hope. She delivered a boy and a girl, small but healthy, their thin cries filling the room with life. When they were placed on her chest, she wept, not from pain, but from a love that overwhelmed her like a wave. They were beautiful. The boy with dark hair like James's, the girl with her light eyes. Sarah called James from the hospital, and Emily took the phone so he could hear them. She held it near the babies, and their faint sounds reached him. She heard him sob, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound, and knew he was crying. "They're here," she said. "They're yours. Ours." "Name them," he rasped. "You choose." Emily looked at the children and, without hesitation, said, "Liam and Ava." "Liam and Ava," he repeated, his voice full of tenderness that made her heart ache. "I want to see them." She promised to bring them as soon as she could, but deep down, she knew time was running out. James clung to life with all he had left. When Emily returned home with the children 3 days later, he was still alive. She brought them to him, laid them beside him on the bed. Liam and Eva rested in tiny blankets, gazing at him with wide eyes. James reached out, touched their faces, and his lips curved into a smile. "They're beautiful," he whispered, "like you." Emily sat beside him, holding his hand. She didn't cry. She didn't want him to see her tears. They spent the day like that, watching the children, talking of trivial things that no longer mattered. At night, he fell asleep, and she stayed, feeling his breath grow fainter. At dawn, he slipped away, quietly, without a struggle, as if he'd done all he'd set out to do. Emily sat with him until the sun rose over the hills, and only then let herself weep. They were tears of grief, but also relief. He'd seen them. He'd made it. She looked at Liam and Eva, sleeping in their cribs, and realized she wasn't alone. She had hope. She had love. She had a family. James had left her more than he'd promised, and she knew she'd carry his memory in their children for the rest of her days. The morning after James's passing was quiet, almost unreal. Emily sat in his room, staring at the empty bed where he'd held her hand just yesterday. Sunlight filtered through the curtains she'd hung for him, casting soft patterns on the floor. Liam and Eva slept in their cribs in the next room, their faint breathing the only sound breaking the silence. She didn't cry anymore. Her tears had run dry in the night when she realized he was gone forever. Now there was only silence within, deep and heavy, like a stone sunk to the bottom of a lake. She knew she had to move on, but she didn't know how. James had been her anchor, not just as the man who'd given her a job and a home, but as the one who'd tied her to this new life. His death left a void she couldn't fill, yet it also gave her 2 babies who were now her everything. Emily stood, fatigue pressing on her shoulders, and walked to the cribs. Liam stirred in his sleep, his tiny fingers curling into a fist, while Ava sighed softly, her light lashes trembling on her cheeks. They were so small, so fragile, yet they held strength, his strength, her strength. The funeral took place 3 days later. Emily arranged it herself, declining help from Marcus, James's lawyer. She wanted it simple, no grand speeches, no crowds of strangers there just for his name. The ceremony was held in the mansion's garden, under the old oak James had loved. Only a few attended: Marcus, Doctor, Linda Harris, Sarah the helper, and a couple of James's old partners he'd respected. Emily stood with the children in her arms, wrapped in warm blankets, and watched as his urn was lowered into the earth. She didn't speak a farewell. It stayed in her heart, unspoken but alive. After the funeral, Marcus approached her with a folder in hand. His face was serious, but his eyes held a softness she hadn't noticed before. "He left everything to you," he said, handing her the papers. "The mansion, the accounts, the funds, and to the kids, of course, when they're older. But he wanted you to know, it's not payment, it's his way of saying thank you." Emily took the folder but didn't open it. She nodded, a lump rising in her throat. Money meant nothing to her. Not now. But the thought that he'd taken care of her, of them, touched her more deeply than she'd expected. She thanked Marcus and went inside, leaving the guests in the garden. She needed to be alone to figure out what came next. The first weeks were tough. Liam and Eva demanded all her time and energy. They woke at night, cried, needed feeding, needed the warmth of her arms. Emily slept in snatches, sometimes just an hour, but she didn't complain. She found odd comfort in it. Their need for her gave her purpose, kept her from drowning in the emptiness James had left. She learned to be a mother step by step, with awkwardness and fear, but also growing confidence. She sang them lullabies she remembered from her mother, stroked their soft heads, whispered about their father. The mansion, once cold and too vast, became their home. Emily didn't let Sarah go. The girl stayed, helping with cleaning and cooking, but now she was more than a helper. She became a friend, a quiet support when Emily felt overwhelmed. They'd often sit together in the kitchen while the kids slept, talking of small things, weather, books, how fast Liam and Eva were growing. These chats were simple, but they kept Emily grounded. Grief came in waves. Some days she could focus on the children, laugh at their first smiles, then, at night, sit in the living room with his letters and cry so softly no one would hear. James had left her dozens of pages, not just for the kids, but for her. In one, written in his shaky hand, he said, "You gave me more than I deserved. I wasn't a good man, Emily, but you made me better. Take care of them, and take care of yourself." She read those lines over and over, hearing his voice in every word, and it was both painful and healing. She hung the medallions he'd left for the children above their cribs. They gleamed in the lamplight, a reminder of his promise. Sometimes she'd hold them, trace the engravings, and think about how to tell Liam and Eva about him. She wanted them to know him not as a shadow from the past, but as a person, complex, lonely, but full of love he hadn't known how to show in life. A year passed. Liam and Eva began to walk, unsteadily, clinging to furniture, but with such determination that Emily couldn't help but smile. They were different. Liam serious, with James's dark eyes, always exploring. Eva bright and giggly, with her gentle nature. They filled the mansion with noise, with life, and Emily felt the void James left slowly recede. She hadn't forgotten him, never would, but the pain softened into a longing she'd learned to live with. She started taking the kids to the garden, planting flowers where there'd once been only lawn. It was her way of leaving a mark, not as grand as James's, but hers. Liam loved digging in the dirt, getting his hands messy, while Eva reached for petals, laughing as they fell on her face. Emily watched them and marveled at how her life had turned out. She'd come here as a housekeeper, and now she was a mother, a homeowner, the keeper of his dream. One spring day, as the kids played on a blanket under the oak, she decided to sort through James's old study. She hadn't touched it since his death, too painful to go in, but now felt ready. She opened the door, and the smell of books, leather, and his cologne hit her like a memory. She sat at his desk, ran her hand over the smooth wood, and started opening drawers. There were papers, old photos, notes on deals that no longer mattered. In the bottom drawer, she found an envelope with her name. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a sheet in his handwriting and a small key. The letter was brief, but each word cut into her soul. Emily, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I wasn't a man of words, but I want you to know. You saved me. Not just the kids, but me. You gave me a family when I thought it was impossible. The keys for a safe in the basement. There's something there for you. Not the kids, you. Live, Emily. You deserve it more than anyone. She found the safe behind an old cabinet in the basement, dusty but intact. The key fit perfectly, and inside was a box. Opening it, she saw a necklace, simple, silver, with a leaf pendant like the ones on the children's medallions. A note lay beside it. This was my mother's. Now it's yours. Emily put it on, feeling its coolness against her skin, and smiled for the first time in a long while without a trace of pain. Years passed. Liam and Ava grew, turning from babies into children full of questions and laughter. Emily told them about James, not as a hero, but as a man. She showed them his letters, photos, took them to the oak where he rested. They listened with wide eyes, and sometimes Liam asked, "Was he like me?" While Ava added, "Did he love us?" Emily always answered honestly, "Yes, he was like you, Liam. And yes, Ava, he loved you. So much." She never remarried, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. Her heart belonged to James, to the kids, to this life they'd built together, however briefly. Men came sometimes, friends of Marcus or Sarah's acquaintances, but she gently declined, offering her quiet smile. What she had was enough. The mansion became their home in every sense. Emily remade it for herself and the kids, replaced cold marble with warm rugs, hung Liam and Eva's drawings on the walls. She opened a small workshop in one room, sewing clothes to sell online, not for money, but for herself. It was her way of moving forward, as he'd asked. When the kids turned 10, she took them to Oregon, to the town where she'd grown up. They stood by her grandmother's now abandoned house, and Emily told them about her childhood, her mother, how she'd ended up in Los Angeles. Liam held her hand, Eva hugged her, and in that moment, she felt a circle close. She'd given them roots she'd barely had herself. One March day, when Liam and Eva were 15, Emily sat in the garden, watching the flowers they'd planted together. The kids were at school, and the mansion was quiet again, but this silence was different. Warm, alive. She held James's letter, the first one he'd written for her, and reread its lines. She was 47, and time had marked her face, but her eyes held a light they hadn't before. She thought of him every day, not with pain, but with gratitude. He was gone, but he'd left her more than he'd promised. Not just the kids, not just the house, but himself. His love lived in Liam and Ava, in their laughter, their questions, their future, and in her. She wore his necklace daily, a reminder that he'd seen more in her than she'd seen in herself. The sun set, painting the sky gold and pink. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the breeze on her skin, and smiled. Somewhere beyond the horizon, she knew he was watching them. Her, Liam, Ava, and perhaps smiling too. Life went on, and in that was happiness, mingled with a quiet sorrow that would never fade. She stood to return to the house and whispered into the void, "Thank you, James, for everything." And it seemed to her the wind answered with his voice,